sugar to keep me going. So this is our 5th one of today, and as I just said to those of you who heard, Tony's been doing this for 30 years. And some of the projects he's done are just fascinating, including Soames Island. And so we're going to be hearing about that, including options for connecting to grid or going off grid. And so can we have a round of applause to welcome Paul?
Yes, I got into this about 30 years ago, and looking after all New Zealand lighthouses, which was a really interesting job, and that's how I got into solar. And then we had a few lighthouses that just weren't keeping up with the demand, and so we put in a wind turbine. The first one destroyed itself within about 6 months, so we did a bit more homework, found out something better, and from there it's taken off. So we specialise we do solar systems, but we specialise in wind and combining wind with solar, which I think is by far the most powerful option, as long as you've got a good wind and good solar supply. So, and I will use Soames Island, which is we put in back in, I think it was about 2011, as a demonstration of the benefits of combining wind and solar. So what I'll just go through is basically the need for a consistent power supply, a brief history of the island, which is, it's fascinating, so if you haven't been over there, well worth a trip. It's a really interesting island. And then looking at the design criteria for Soames, and what the chosen system was, and then start looking at how the system is performed, and the benefits of combining wind and solar, and then just looking at the future and where they can go from here. So just as a start, these are older figures, but back in 2022, the grid was between 87 and 89% renewably powered, and that is the how it was made up. So mainly hydro, quite a lot of geothermal, and then a bit of wind and a fraction solar. Those figures have changed a little bit over time, but New Zealand says, oh well, we're doing great, we're doing roughly 90% renewable. That last 10% will be expensive to achieve. But when you actually look at the energy usage of New Zealand, we're down at 33%. So when you look at all our energy, which includes coal-fired boilers, vehicles, we're only at 33%, and 67%. So there's plenty of room to improve on that, much more cost effectively than trying to up the percentage of the grid. And there are low-hanging fruit, so things like more electric vehicles, heating, cooking, going to heat pumps, and there's hot water heat pumps now as well as air heat pumps. So there's a wide range, both domestically and commercially, where we can increase our electrical demand, and we can bring this figure up really cheaply and effectively and easily, whereas trying to bring that figure up is going to involve more batteries, more storage, and it's an expensive way of going, whereas at the moment, I think we're better off looking at our total energy. So, capacity doubt. I mean, you hear these things, not enough generation to increase the electrical loads. Now, I was listening to the chief executive of Genesis, and he turned that completely on the head and said, well, actually, there's not enough electrical load for us to invest in generation. There are something like 20 or more wind farms that are fully consented, but there's no incentive for the companies to start investing and start building them because there isn't enough electrical energy or enough load. So the more load we put onto the grid, the more incentive there is for the power companies to increase the energy supply. And there's plenty of room, already consented room, to increase the renewable energy supply. So when you hear people say, well, we haven't got enough power, that actually should be turned around on its head. We haven't got enough load to allow or incentivize the power companies to invest. And then what some famous person said, that what do you do when the wind stops and you're watching TV? Well, what I'll do in this presentation to show you that absolutely isn't an issue. There's plenty you can do when the wind stops blowing. So, looking at the history of Machi Soames, it started off as a Maori car. It then became, in the settler days, a human quarantine station. So they put people on board or on Soames Island to make sure that they didn't have the smallpox or whatever other diseases there were. It then also became a post office, interestingly enough, for the lighthouse service. So the lighthouses had pigeons, and Machi Soames was, because the lighthouse service headquarters was in Wellington, Machi Soames became the central post office for the lighthouse service, and all their carrier pigeons came in. It was an internment camp during the wars, and they've still got some of the old buildings left from that. And it was also a degaussing station in the war for the ships, so that technically the magnetic signature of the ship, so that they wouldn't activate magnetic mines. So you put a big coil around the ships and you reverse the magnetism on a ship. So it was a degaussing station. There's gun defences on the island, at the top of the island, and then after that it became an animal quarantine station. So from about the wartime through till I think it was the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, it was a quarantine station for MAF. And that stopped when MAF started recording sperm and what have you in little test tubes rather than having to bring the whole wool into the country. So after they left, DOC took over, and it's now a nature and scientific reserve, and that's what it still is. Owned by the local Maori, but run by the Department of Conservation. So when we looked at it, initially there was an underground cable that fed power from Seaview out to the island. And then the yachties kept pulling that up with their anchors, and after a while, once too often, they pulled it up and it was considered to be beyond repair. So they then put 3 generators on the island, different size generators depending on the load, and that ran for, I don't know quite how long, but 10, 15 years they were running on diesel generators. And it's a full 3-phase system. So it's a complete community. There are actually about 5 houses on the island, 3 motel blocks, there was a campground, there was a water system, a sewage system, there's a crane on the wharf, so it's a complete mini community and a really good way of highlighting how power can be supplied to a community, and it just needs to be expanded up to look at larger communities or New Zealand as a whole. So, as I say, that was the requirements. The houses were 3 full-time residents, but the rest of the accommodation was filled to a certain level almost every day. So they had scientists on board, they had a few tourists on board, but on the island. But between scientists, people working on the island, like myself, going over to do work on the island, most of that accommodation is used for most of the time. So they can have up to 65 short stay residents and up to 400 day trippers every day. So the total load was about 25,000, and what they required was the renewables to produce about 11,000 kilowatt hours, 65% of their predicted usage. So we started off by looking at storage of power on the island. So when you've got surplus renewables, you store it in some form of device. So at the time, and remember this was back in 2011, flow batteries were new on the scene. The technology hadn't progressed far enough, and so we decided it was a bit too risky to go down a flow battery, and they were also very expensive. Lithium batteries, very early days of lithium batteries, they also were very expensive in those days, and so they were ruled out on a cost basis. We looked at actually water storage, pump storage, which is, in theory, a really, really good way of storing energy. So when you've got surplus energy, you pump water up to the top of the hill, and then when you're short, you let it go, run a generator. What we decided for something like Soames, mini hydro is not really good for providing peak load of energy. You can get very good 1 kilowatt mini hydro power, which is really, really good for providing 1 kilowatt for 24 hours a day, and you store your surplus in batteries, so you use that when you need it. But if you're using it to provide peak loading, you might want 5 kilowatts of peak load. You need a very big or much larger hydro, and then the costs start booming. The amount of water you need to store is very large. So for a small system like this, pump storage wasn't a good idea. Commercially, when you've got big reservoirs, and totally different question, and I think in that sort of situation it can be a very good way of storing surplus. And then lead acid batteries, which were the commonplace, the norm at the time, and that's the way we decided to go, because these other technologies either weren't quite there, too expensive, or just didn't suit. So we went with the lead acid battery. So this is the system. So we ended up by putting a 6 kilowatt wind turbine in. Domestically wise, it's a reasonably big turbine. You wouldn't necessarily put that into a house. You could get away with something smaller unless you were a very good user of electricity. So we've got a 6 kilowatt wind turbine, that's from Scotland. That's 4 kilowatts of solar. We were really constrained on where you could put solar, because all these buildings, one, they had asbestos, but two, they were protected buildings. We couldn't put solar anywhere near it. So this one here is just a garage and workshop space and wasn't historic or protected. So we were allowed to put solar on there. And that is all we needed to do for, as I say, 5 houses, 3 motels, and everything else. This itself is the power room. So those yellow inverters are what is providing the grid. So they're grid forming, they provide the grid, they're fed by the batteries, and they provide a constant 3-phase. So each one of those inverters is a different phase. The red one on the far side is the solar inverter, so it's just taking solar, putting it to the AC side, and the left-hand side is the wind turbine ones. So that is the, if you like, the power room that's providing to the whole island. And the batteries are situated just behind this wall over here. So then we get to the exciting part, at least exciting part for mathematicians. Looking at, this is monthly performance data. So The red is how much energy is provided by the wind turbine, and the green is how much is provided by the solar. So other than a couple of surplus months where you've got a very generous amount of power, you've got right through the year, you've got a pretty consistent level of generation. When you look at solar on its own, you get about a third of the power in the middle of winter than you do get in the middle of summer. So you get a real big peak in the summer months and a real dip in the winter months. And unless you've got a big cooling load, most people's load are the opposite way around, where they're using more power in the winter. So it doesn't fit with most installations, where this gives you a much smoother level. One thing just to be aware of is we're only measuring how much energy is used. So when the batteries are full, the wind and the solar stops generating. So potentially, if there'd been more usage on the island, we would have actually generated more. So the generation is limited because we've got no grid to put it to. All you've got is a battery. When the battery's full, there's nowhere for it to go. So it has to stop generating so you don't cook the batteries. So that just shows you a very consistent through the year. But what's more interesting, we then took a medium term and we looked at weekly performances. So this is performance during the winter months. So it took 3 weeks, I think. Well, a bit more than that. Almost 4 months of usage. And again, you get this very consistent level of total generation. You get 1 or 2 weeks where it's a little bit under, and 1 or 2 where it's high, but it's pretty consistent. And we did the same thing for the summer months, and you get the same result. But just noticing that in the summer months you're more reliant on the solar, surprisingly enough, and in the winter you're more reliant on the wind. So it just shows that combination. We then took it down a little bit further and took it on a day-by-day process. And again, you get a little bit of ups and downs and a few peaks, but again, it's pretty consistent. Every day, there is a good level of generation. And that's for the winter, same thing for the summer. But again, you notice summer's solar, mainly solar, winter's mainly wind. What then becomes really interesting is micro, looking at it on an hourly basis. So 3 days in the summer, there was only 3 hours in that whole 3-week period where there was no generation. Now, there was low generation on some of it, but there was only 3 days when we actually got nothing at all. Took that in the winter, not a single day when there wasn't any generation. Again, there are some days where it's fairly low, but you had something every day. And it's that consistency which is so important. Soames works really well because you get as the sun dies down, the sea breeze picks up. So come 6 o'clock in the evening, sun's going down, all of a sudden the sea breeze picks up. So it might have been quiet wind all day, but it picks up at 6 when you've got no sunshine, and then that runs through the night. When the sun comes up, the wind drops down, it repaces it. So it's and you can see where the sun's shining, the wind tends to be low. When the sun isn't shining, the wind tends to go up, and it's that process of the sea breeze coming in and picking up. So we then looked at, well, what's equivalent? So what we put in was 4 kilowatts of solar and a 6 kilowatt wind turbine. And we decided, well, let's do a calculation of what we would have needed to do if it had been purely wind or purely solar. So we'll go through that one. and on a month, if we looked at it on a monthly basis, a purely solar system would have been 22 kilowatts of solar or 12 kilowatt wind turbine. And that was worked out on getting the same reduction in diesel usage. So we've got a standby diesel generator, so to get the same amount of energy or the same level of usage from the diesel, that's the equivalent. If we wanted to do it on a weekly basis, get the same, all of a sudden we were up to 58 kilowatts of solar, 10 kilowatt wind turbine, or in the summer, obviously a little less solar, obviously, and a bit more wind. And then on a daily one, to get the same reduction in diesel generated, you're talking about 136 kilowatts of solar, 73 kilowatt wind turbine, but the other thing is you need 2, 3, or even 4 times as big a battery bank, because you're being much more reliant on the battery for those periods where there's no generation. And that's the same thing in the summer months. So you can see that these figures here, that combination is a really, really powerful combination. And that would be, that's the same if you're talking about New Zealand Corp, by bringing in, and as more solar comes into the mix with the national generation, you're going to get a much more level or consistent level of power being generated. So the other way of looking at it is battery voltages. So that's a really messy graph and doesn't tell you an awful lot. But when we put in this line, which roughly equates to about an 80% state of charge of the batteries. So with batteries, you want to keep the state of charge as high as possible. Not quite so true with lithium, but still true to an extent. So you can see very rarely did we ever drop below 80% on the charge of the battery. And that line puts in 95%. So noting that generation starts to slow, the inverters start to slow down about 90% and completely turn off at 100%. There's a whole range where we are losing energy from the system or not generating it. So potentially that system would generate a lot more with a bigger load applied to it. So the results, yeah, that's what we were asked to do, 11,000. What it does do is 12,500, which is about 94% of their actual usage. So we're still reliant 6% for those few days where there's not much wind, not much sun. And so they just run their diesel to cover that last 6%. But all of a sudden that means that their diesel generation, fueling it, they just go on the ordinary ferry with 20 litre cans of diesel, whereas before they were taking drums. They had to have a special boat to take the drums of diesel, 44-gallon drums out, because they were using such a lot. So the supply of diesel, in the early days, half of the cost was the diesel and half of the cost was shipping the diesel out to the island. It costs as much as the diesel. Well, now there's no shipping cost really. It's purely just the diesel cost. And again, that's just noting that when the batteries are full, we're not measuring all potential generation. So benefits of combining. So it evens out the large peaks and troughs of power generation. So whether you've got only wind, whether you've got only solar, you get these large peaks where you can't do anything with the surplus, and you get large troughs where you need another source of power. It allows for a much smaller battery bank. You're not as reliant, because it's a consistent supply, you're not nearly as reliant on the batteries to provide your energy. You still need batteries and you're still reliant on them for a little bit, but nothing like it now. So you can halve or even third the size of your battery bank. And that is a big, big cost saving. It extends the battery life. Going back to that graph of the battery state of charge, we were rarely under 80 and virtually never under 60%. Battery's life is based on how many cycles. So the more cycles you have, it's based on say, a lead acid around about 1,500 cycles, lithium battery about 6,000 cycles. And once you hit that cycle, the battery will start degrading. Well, just turn off immediately, but it'll be degrading significantly. So we're not cycling the batteries as deeply or as frequently, so your battery life can be doubled or even tripled. Much better match of load and generation. If you can use the power when it's being generated, it saves all the inefficiencies of having to store it and then convert it back again. And you lose a little bit of energy every time you convert from one form to another, you lose something. So the more that you can use directly, the better. And that's particularly true with grid type, where when you're exporting at, if you're lucky, 18 cents, if you're most of them about 9, 11 cents, and then you're buying it back out at night at 25 cents or 30 cents. So it's only 50% efficiency, you're losing 50% of it. So the more you can use yourself, the much more efficient and cost effective that system becomes. And localized, it brings your local generation, and the wider you have, the further you have to transport the energy, the more the losses. So if you can keep generation localized, one, it's a safety factor because you've got your own generation, but two, you're not having to ship it. So you're not losing as much. So looking at the future of sounds, introduction of electric vehicles. Now they've done that, they've got a little golf cart which they use for carrying stuff up from the wharf to the houses. And that, again, has been a way of increasing the electrical load, but it also means that they've got rid of their 4x4, which was using a lot of petrol, so that's gone. So further electrification, low wattage heaters, heat pumps, tools, they've put in a whole pile of heat pumps now, very effective, so the houses are much warmer than they used to be. They used to just have electric radiators, which they didn't want to run because it was going to run their diesel. And in the diesel days, they only had power on the island for a couple of hours in the morning, an hour at midday, and about 4 hours at night. And so they didn't have a 24-hour power supply. So they can bring in more electrical equipment. They've got electric tools now. So it's allowed them to increase that. Conversion from gas cooking to electric, they haven't done much on that, except that they are now, all the electric kettles have been got off the island. They're now bringing those back, and if it's windy or sunny, they use the electric jug. If they're short of power, they just go back to the gas kettle. So they're managing it themselves, but yeah, they're converting and getting less gas and more electric. Make hydrogen for water heating and cooking. Callaghan were doing a very interesting project on the island where we were using the surplus. So when the batteries were full, we started generating hydrogen and storing that hydrogen. Now, as far as it went was we had a gas barbecue which we could demonstrate, and they also had one hot water telethon for the hot water in the workshops that was run off the hydrogen. The intention was to then start bringing one of the houses onto hydrogen cooking. That is in abeyance at the moment because they're in the process of trying to find a company to commercialise the research that Callaghan have been doing. So once they find someone, if they find someone to commercialise it, they might reinstigate the system on Soames Island. But it was an interesting project because in the early days, the very first one was up in Woodville, and they had a farm and there's a wind turbine on the top of the hill, and it was about 2 or 3 miles down the hill to the farmhouse. So to cable that with power would have cost an absolute fortune. Hydrogen, one of the best ways of storing hydrogen is just in water pipe. Alkaline water pipe has got a very small molecular structure, so as long as you're not storing it at high pressure, it's a really, really good way. So they just mold plowed a water pipe down the hill behind the tractor, really cheap way of doing it. But they then had a fuel cell at the bottom and converted the hydrogen back into electricity. By the time you had the inefficiencies of the electrolyzer at the top of the hill and the fuel cell at the bottom, it lost a lot of its energy. So that was when they decided, well, actually, rather than converting it back into electricity, why don't we burn it? And of course, you get rid of one of the inefficiencies with the fuel cell. And so burning it for heating or cooking made a lot of sense. And the idea was that that would replace LPG. So in remote islands, remote settlements, you could get rid of having to take LPG out because you could generate your own gas. So hopefully that project will get going again, because it had it was early days, but it had quite a lot of potential. So that's just me giving you a background of Soames and how Soames Island can be expanded as much as you like into bigger communities, and what those advantages are. Now, I spoke to one of the leading lights in Meridian and said, well, look, you should be putting solar panels on West Wind. They said, oh, well, the lines are fully utilised with the wind. I said, well, are you sure on a nice sunny day, when there's not much wind, those lines are going to be completely underutilised, and the cost of purely the solar is minimal. I mean, if you're having to put in all the infrastructure and more lines and everything else, the solar farm becomes expensive. But all you're doing is putting up a few solar panels. It's not a big cost, and if you've got the rest of the infrastructure, so I still think they should be doing that. They may not get the full potential, but they're not having to put the full cost in either. But yeah, any questions, any suggestions, any thoughts?
About the domestic use for domestic home, solar wind. I mean, most of us go for solar ones because it's easy, it's available, and it's local. On the internet, there's lots of domestic solar options, and I wonder how to just rip off beds or whether they're actually genuine sockets. So, when you go to a wind turbine on your house, they're absolutely illegal.
Okay, so wind turbines, to be fair, aren't really suitable in an urban environment for a couple of reasons. One, you get a lot of turbulence of wind around buildings, so you've got to get the turbine well above the roof lines, and then it becomes a visual distraction. There's always a little bit of noise. They're not that noisy, but they're not silent, so they don't really work. Now, there are turbines, vertical shaft turbines, that are advertised to be put on buildings. My advice is to stay well clear of them. We were given I've actually got a vertical shaft turbine at home. It's not on a house, but we were given it to try, and it's pretty useless. And I've been called out to people who've put them on and said, can you get this thing working? And really, it's very difficult. There's a vertical shaft, for a start, vertical shaft turbine isn't as efficient as a horizontal one, and you can prove that theoretically. So you end up with a much bigger turbine for the same power output. And we've got a turbine that's about the same size as one of those, 6 kilowatts, and it produces, well, if it does produce, it produces about 1 kilowatt. So, yeah, they don't work. But one advantage they have is they are a lot quieter. So that's why people are putting them into an urban environment. And it doesn't matter which way the wind comes from in a horizontal aspect, because it picks up the same wind wherever. But when you start looking at a rolling turbulence, if you've got higher wind speed at the top of the blades and lower, you get more lift at the top than you do at the bottom, so you get a tilt and you start wearing bearings because it's constantly trying to go out of balance and tilt. So yeah, it's something that has potential. There are advantages in vertical shaft, and one day I'm still looking for one. They're all much the same. So you get conch shells, you get ones with curved blades. There are various different sorts. There's one company that's doing a really good PR campaign at the moment, and to my mind, they're lying through the back of their teeth. They're calling a 10 kilowatt turbine, and there's no way you'll ever get 10 kilowatts out of the size of turbine that they're suggesting. You can get a pretty good idea what the output of a turbine is from its size. It will take a few percent for efficiencies or inefficiencies or how it's designed, but within a very small range of power outputs, you can pretty much say what you're going to get looking at the size of the turbine. And this is a small turbine, and I think when you look at the small print, they're talking about wind speeds of 200k to get to 12k, but on 10 kilowatts, they don't say that in 200k wind, that turbine will probably blow itself to pieces before you ever get your 10 kilowatts.
Your coastal site there, inland, is the wind profile different or not as consistent?
Yes, so it can be as consistent, yes. So you've got to be careful about what your wind resource is. So there are certain areas of New Zealand where, you just wouldn't put a wind turbine because there's just not enough wind. And you've then got to look at how gusty the wind is and how reliable. So very often you're much better off, you'll generate a lot more power with so go back a step. There are average winds. NIWA produce average wind speeds, and so you can get an average wind speed of 4 meters per second. Now, if you had 4 meters per second all day long, you actually wouldn't get very much generation out of that turbine. It would be generating, but the generation would be quite low. If you had it for 8 meters per second for 12 hours and nothing for 12 hours, still giving you your 4 meters average, you'll actually get a considerable amount of power because the power output is cubic relationship with wind speed. So you double your wind speed, you get 8 times more power out of it. So again, you've got to look at what your average wind speed is, and then the next stage is to look, well, how is that average made up? So you don't need a consistent wind, which is why solar, combining it with solar, is so important and beneficial, because in the 12 hours you've got no wind, you've got your solar, hopefully. But yes, you need to look at what that wind profile is before you actually decide, is wind actually going to be worthwhile or not. It's not worthwhile in every single position by any means. But if you've got the wind resource, it's a very powerful tool to combine with solar.
Better on the rise or something like that?
It depends on the rise. So very often, if in a valley, it's really good at the top. It can be really good at the bottom if the valley is funneling. It can be that on the side of it, it's not as good. So sometimes you want to put it at the bottom or at the top, but not necessarily on the side. So you've got to look at where the wind's coming from and how frequent that wind is blowing. So it's part of it's a lot more difficult to design a wind system than it is to design a solar system. There's a sun, point the solar panels at the sun, and you can't really go wrong. Wind, you can go wrong, so it takes a little bit more in those early stages to actually make sure that the system is going to be suitable for where it's being positioned.
When you developed Soames, battery technology was at a certain level. What would you say about it now?
What I'd say about it now is I would almost definitely go with lithium batteries currently. I mean, I think in 10 years' time we will be on something totally different. So I'm not sure lithium have got a long-term future. The talk of sodium batteries is there's a whole range of battery technologies that are still in the lab that haven't actually been commercialised. Some of them will be, some of them will go out back door as being useless, say. But currently, lithium is by far the best. A little bit more expensive than some of the lead acid batteries, but over the life of the batteries, you get a much longer life, and full life costings are as low, if not cheaper, than some lead acids now. So, and another big advantage with lithium that you don't get with lead acids is you've got the ability to grow the system over time. So rather than designing a system and saying, I need this size of battery, and battery is an expensive part of any system. It's a lot of the cost is in the battery. So with lithium, you can say, well, okay, I can afford to put this much in. I'll just try it and see, and if it works, I'll leave it with that. If I need to put a little bit more in, you can just slot another lithium battery in. And because they self-manage each battery itself, you can add a new battery to an old battery. You couldn't do that with a lead acid, because what happened with a lead acid, if you added a new to an old, what it did is brought the level of the new battery down to the level of the old battery. So you could do it for the first year without too much issue, but more than a year, you're really wasting a lot of money by changing it. So if you wanted to upgrade, you really had to throw the old one out, even if it had half its life left, and then put in a completely bigger one. So that's another big advantage of lithium. It leaves your options open. You don't have to commit yourself on day one. And nowadays, you don't, with grid-tied systems, you don't even have to commit yourself to a battery, because a lot of the hybrid inverters, which is a good way of going for definitely domestic or smaller systems. What we've done on Soames Island is still probably better for a larger system, particularly a large geographic system, because you can bring power on anyway. You don't need to bring it to a central point. Say, I've forgotten where I was going there. That's hybrid inverters. So most of the hybrid you can actually run with or without batteries. So you can put your solar system in, your wind system in, your wind and solar system in, and forget about batteries and think, well, 2 years down the track, battery prices have come down a little bit, electricity prices have gone up a bit, batteries are now much more cost effective, so you can, and then you just add a battery to the system. You don't have to worry about what you've got there. There's no changes in what you've already got. You just add a battery. So it's a lot more flexible now than it was even 3 years ago. Of not having to commit yourself to a full system. You can grow the system as you go.
Can I just clarify something Tony said? Is that when he started that explanation, he did say that's with a hybrid inverter. So if you're setting up solar and you plan on, if you want to keep the option of getting a battery, make sure you tell your solar provider that from the start, because the type of inverter they'll sell you will be
absolutely. So, so there are three basic types of inverter. There's a battery inverter, and that is there purely to take energy from the battery and convert it into AC power, which is what those 3 yellow ones were on Soames Island. And you can't put solar, you can't put, they don't take solar, they don't take wind, so you actually have to have a wind inverter and a solar inverter on top of it. So you then get your what they call a grid-tied string inverter, and that is there purely to take power from your wind turbine or power from your solar panel, and it puts power onto your electrical system. Now, if you're going with a grid-tied system, that's all you actually need, and it's cheaper than a hybrid inverter. A hybrid inverter is really clever because it actually combines those two inverters into one unit. So it does the battery, and you feed your solar or your wind into that same inverter. So rather than having to have two inverters, you end up with one inverter. It's a little bit more expensive than the string inverter, so by putting a string inverter in solar, it's a cheaper way of going grid tied, but it's if you want to put, or you think you might want to put batteries on, you end up by doubling the cost because you then have to buy another inverter, whereas if you put a hybrid one in that does everything, you don't need the batteries, but you can then just add batteries and you don't have to invest in any more inverters. So, yeah, a little bit more money up front, but it gives you the flexibility to add batteries really, really easily.
Can I take you back to the wind story about the maintenance cost over the lifetime of wind, because it's so quite low?
Maintenance cost isn't that great. So basically for this sort of wind turbine, it's a once a year, and if you're in a low wind zone, that can be once every 2 years. So if the wind isn't as strong, so you're talking about once a year or once every 2 years, you drop they're all the ones we do, because I don't like working at heights or anything. They're on hinge mast, you drop the turbine, and you're just re-greasing bearings, you're checking torques on bolts, because they do loosen over time, and then you put it up. So it's half a day's work once a year or once every other year. So it's not a big cost. For the first few years, we sort of have to do it to maintain warranties, but after the 5-year or whatever the warranty period, it's very simple maintenance. So it's something that if you've got the ability or the tools, then yeah, it's easy enough to do yourself. But so it's not a big cost. There is a cost, but it's not a big one.
If you were in a situation where there's a tree and you put shade on some of your panels, I understand you're better off with a string inverter then because the panels can operate at different levels?
Okay. So if you've got partial shading, this is an area that is actually developing reasonably quickly at the moment. So partial shading, it used to be that it's like a hose pipe. If you crimp a hose pipe, you lose the flow through the whole hose pipe. And the same thing is true with solar panels. If you shade it, you basically lost the whole string. So the first thing that happened was they had optimizers on the panel. So you could stick a little box on DC optimizer on the panel, and if that panel was shaded, it basically bypassed that panel and the rest of them carried on. The other way of doing it was to use microinverters. So every panel had its own little microinverter. And that did the same thing. So every panel was individually inverting and charging. So one shaded panel, you just lost that panel, you didn't lose anything else. SMA, one of the big solar inverter manufacturers, bought out the company that did optimizers, pinched all their technology, and then put the company back on the market again. I'm not sure what's happened to them now, but and I'm not quite sure how they've done it, but they have bought that technology into their inverter. So it's what they call a shade fix, so that you can, if one panel is shaded, they can still generate using the power from the other ones. They do it by affecting the MPP voltage, but more than that, I don't fully understand how it's done, and they're not going to tell me how it's done. It's absolute IP for them. So, yeah, now, as far as I know it, that technology hasn't come into hybrid, but SMA are beginning to get into hybrid inverters now as well. So that technology will be in a SMA hybrid inverter, probably not in other hybrids. And again, it may not even be in some of the other string inverters. So shaded panels, microinverters work really well with shaded panels, but just be careful about the inverter that you put on the system if you get shading for some of the day, because you might lose the whole string. So yeah, it is something to really consider up front in the design and the choice of equipment.
That cleaning panels, how often do you have to clean the panels? And what can you clean them with?
Okay. How long's a piece of string? So panel cleaning, some panels you'll never need to clean. One of the reasons that you don't have panels too shallow is that the steeper you have them, the better they are at self-cleaning. So you've got the effect of a steeper angle works better in the winter, shallower angle works better in the summer. And again, with wind, because we're not so worried about winter, we tend to flatten the panels off a little bit. But if you're looking at a high winter usage, you tend to have a much steeper angle. So it depends on angle of panel. It depends on how much dust and dirt there is in the air and how much lands. If you've got a lot of pollen, that'll land on the panels. It depends on how suspect they are to lichen. And so some places, the panels we've got at home are horrendous. They just seem to grow lichen. But other places you never see it. So it's you clean them when they're dirty. So the next part of the question, what do you clean them with? Ideally you don't, well, first thing you do not use is high pressure water. So you don't use a water blaster, because that will blast into the seals around it and you'll wreck the panel. So definitely not high pressure water. They say soap isn't ideal because if you use soap it leaves a film on top of the panel, which can affect the future generation. How much it affects it I don't know, but ideally you just use a soft brush and water. If you've got lichen growing on it, then you may have to scrape it off. If you scrape it off, make sure it's a wooden or plastic scraper, not a metal scraper, because the last thing you want to do is scratching the glass. So you clean it as gently as you can, and if just water and a rag or a brush doesn't work, then you go up to the next stage and use a plastic scraper or what have you. So be as gentle as you can. Chemicals, again, are not supposed to be good. Again, because they can, things like 30 seconds or whatever you put on your roof, they can actually eat away at the seals around the panel. Now I have noticed that Ideal Electrical have actually come out, and I've got a little thing of it, I haven't actually investigated it yet, of solar panel cleaner. So there are, I know you may have more information on cleaning solar panels. So yes, they've got a solar panel cleaner. So as I say, I don't know anything about it yet, but I'm going to investigate it. But basically, clean them as gently as you can with as fewer chemicals as you can. But the one thing is definitely don't put a water blaster on them.
Mike uses his electric leaf blower, our chief executive, but his ones, that's on his ground mounted ones, and he said that works really well.
Yeah. I mean, I've just had to, because I've been a solar installer and everything else, like a typical builder, I mean, our solar panels got absolutely covered with lichen. So I've had to resort to a scraper. The only way I can get it off is with a scraper. But if you do, make sure it's a plastic one or a wooden one that isn't going to scratch the panels.
Is there tech that actually tells you what the efficiency of the panel is? So it measures the sunlight and energy in another way, and then feeds that and tells you what the panels are generating, so you can see a deterioration.
Yeah, most of the inverters, in fact, most inverters now have online monitoring attached to them, so it's very easy to see if you're getting a drop off of expected. You still got to assess how much sun is there and everything else, but you can usually tell if there's a drop off of efficiency and you're getting less energy out of them than you were a month ago or whatever. So that's a pretty good way of indicating that you need to do something with them. But again, going back to the lighthouses, most of the lighthouse sites never needed cleaning. They got washed off, even if there's a little bit of salt on it. That just got washed off the next time, and if you cleaned it, well, next storm was going to get more salt on it, so there's little point. But they tended, in fact, the salt probably killed any lichen growth, so it had its benefits as well. So yeah, clean them when you need to, and there's no time scale that you should be cleaning. One person will have to be cleaning them every month, another person will never even ever have to clean them, so it's difficult.
Yeah, the lichen one was the one I was wondering about. The lichen.
Lichen, yeah. So if you're getting lichen, the more frequently you clean them to try and get it before it actually embeds itself. So you get it early, you'll be able to wipe it off with a brush or a rag. You let it establish, then you onto the scrapers.
Do you have any comment on lead carbon batteries?
Lead carbon? No, I don't know an awful lot about lead carbon. I'm not sure. They're probably better than lead acid. I prefer the lithium at the moment. But to be honest, I don't have a great deal of knowledge about the lead carbon, so can't really advise one way or the other.
Was there a final question here? Otherwise, I'll leave it.
You mentioned with the solar on solars, that if you had too much electricity, you just would have to throw it away. Obviously, with wind turbine, you can turn it out the wind.
Okay, different turbines work differently. So with solar, basically you open circuit it so that the solar just stops producing. With wind, you tend to have a dump node.
I just disconnected that.
So with wind, you tend to have a dump node, so that I think we've gone too far, haven't we? So what tends to happen is that if there's no load on the island or no load on the system, the way this system works, and every system works differently, is those yellow ones, when the batteries are full, pushes the frequency up a little bit. When the wind or the solar see the frequency's gone up, and you're talking about from 50 hertz to 51 hertz or 52, so it's not a big increase. The solar and wind inverters say, well, we're going to shut down, or we're going to slow. They'll throttle to begin with, and when it reaches about 53 hertz, they'll just shut off completely. So when the wind turbine inverter has got no output, what happens is the turbine starts to rotate a little bit quicker because it's got no load on it. The voltage goes up, and that first red box is a controller, and it opens up a dump load. So that silver box is basically a heater. So as the voltage goes up, it opens up and it dumps the load onto the heater. It puts a big load, the turbine will stall, it will slow down, it'll stop dumping and then it'll carry on just oscillating. So that heater takes your surplus energy from a wind turbine.
And it doesn't get too hot.
No. You'll make sure that, because what it doesn't do, it doesn't heat up and stay on. It actually stalls the turbine. So it puts a big load on the turbine stalls, slows down, the heater goes off, and then slowly the turbine winds up, and if there's still not needed, it stalls again. So, and very often you'll see a turbine just clocking around the tower, because as it stalls, the Coriolis force pushes it round, so it's a really strange to look at, but all of a sudden the turbine will be going round and round the top of the tower. Which gets people really worried when they first have it, they first put their turbine, I get this phone call saying, what's happening to my turbine? But it's all designed.
We do need to wrap things up there, everyone, but thank you so much for joining us. This is electric cherry juice from Electric Cherry
Oh, lovely.
So thank you so much, Tony, for that. And then I've also got a bottle for you as well, Bruce, who has been recording all of these sessions so that people who weren't able to join us today will be able to check out that content online. So thank you so much as well, Bruce, for today. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.